The Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar.
Their voices, woven together, created a sound that literally defined a generation. It was a perfect harmony, a seamless blend of poetry and melody that spoke of silence, boxers, and bridges over troubled water. Simon and Garfunkel were more than just a musical duo, they were an institution. The architects of a sound that felt as intimate as a secret and as vast as a cathedral. Their music was a monument to a friendship that seemed, at least from the outside, to be just as perfect, but what if that monument was built on a foundation of cracks? What if the voices that blended so beautifully on vinyl were actually raised in anger and frustration behind closed studio doors? The story of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel isn't just about musical genius. It's a story of brotherhood and betrayal, of jealousy and genius walking hand in hand. It's the story of how two boys from Queens, New York, who shared a dream, could conquer the world and, in the process, lose each other completely. They started as childhood best friends and became one of the most celebrated musical duos of all time. Their harmonies were proof of a seemingly unbreakable bond. But right after their biggest hit, a song that became an anthem of comfort for millions, their friendship shattered. This led to decades of public fights and a bitter silence that was often louder than any of their songs. This is the story of how a friendship, forged in the suburbs of New York, imploded at the absolute height of its fame, and why, for years, Paul Simon would refuse to even speak to Art Garfunkel. To understand how deep the fracture was, you have to understand how deep the bond was. Before the world knew them as Simon and Garfunkel, they were just Paul and Artie. They met back in 1953, two 11-year-old kids at a public school in Queens, cast in a production of Alice in Wonderland. Paul was the White Rabbit, Art was the Cheshire Cat. It was a pretty normal start for a relationship that would end up changing the entire landscape of popular music. They lived just a few blocks from each other in the quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Forest Hills. Their world was stickball games, comic books, and a growing, all-consuming passion for music. The radio was crackling with this new, electrifying sound of rock and roll, and Paul and Artie were hooked. They'd huddle around the radio, listening to Elvis, but it was the tight, perfect harmonies of the Everly Brothers that really got to them. They heard something in Don and Phil Everly's voices that felt like their own budding partnership. Even back then, Paul was the engine. He was the one with the relentless drive, the one who bought a guitar and taught himself how to play it. He was the one who started writing songs, pouring all his teenage angst and ambition into lyrics and melodies. And Art, with his soaring, angelic tenor, was the perfect instrument for Paul's work. He had this voice that was almost impossibly pure, a crystalline counterpoint to Paul's more down-to-earth, narrative style. They spent countless hours in Art's basement, practicing, harmonizing, taking apart Everly Brothers' songs piece by piece and then trying to build their own. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a shared obsession. They even developed a unique way of singing, recording themselves over and over, listening back, trying to get the blend so perfect that their two voices sounded like one. Their friendship was their first and most important collaboration, built on a shared language of melody and the gut feeling that they had something special. As Simon himself later said, they were best friends, and that early bond was pure and simple. By the time they were 16, they were calling themselves Tom and Jerry, a name that captured their youthfulness and maybe, subconsciously, their cat and mouse dynamic. Paul became Jerry Landis, and Art was Tom Graff, names they picked to sound less Jewish, which was a common thing for entertainers to do back then. They scraped together enough cash to record a song Paul had written, Hey Schoolgirl. It was a catchy, Everly Brothers-style pop song, and to their complete shock, it became a minor hit. In 1957, Tom and Jerry had a record deal and a song climbing the Billboard charts. They even got on Dick Clark's American Bandstand, lip-syncing their hit on the same stage as legends like Jerry Lee Lewis. For two teenagers from Queens, it was a dizzying, intoxicating taste of a world they had only dreamed of. They were on the inside. The dream was real. But this first taste of fame also planted the first, tiny seed of a conflict that would one day tear them apart. A conflict over who wrote what, and who got the credit. The success of Hey Schoolgirl didn't last. Their next few singles went nowhere, and the Tom and Jerry act fizzled out as fast as it started. The boys finished high school and, it seemed, put their musical dreams on a shelf. They went to different colleges, and for a while, it looked like Tom and Jerry would just be a cute story they'd tell their kids one day. But the connection, and the music, wasn't gone. It had just gone quiet, waiting for the right moment to come back, stronger than they could ever have imagined. As the early 1960s rolled in, the music world was completely changing. The polished pop of the 50s was being replaced by the raw, socially aware energy of the folk revival. In the coffeehouses of Greenwich Village, a new generation of songwriters was taking over, armed with acoustic guitars and lyrics that spoke to a changing America. This was the world Paul Simon was pulled into. After college, he found his way back to music, writing songs that were way more introspective and poetic than his Tom and Jerry stuff. Art Garfunkel, meanwhile, was studying math at Columbia University, but he couldn't shake the pull of music, or of his partnership with Paul. They started performing together again, but this time, under their real names. The novelty act was gone, replaced by a serious artistic ambition. They sharpened their skills in the folk clubs of New York, their sound maturing into something totally unique. Simon's intricate, literary songs lifted up by Garfunkel's stunningly pure voice. In 1964, they were noticed by Columbia Records producer Tom Wilson, the same guy who signed Bob Dylan. He gave them an audition, and the duo got a contract with the legendary label. They recorded their first album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m. It was a collection of stark, acoustic songs, a mix of Simon's originals, including an early version of The Sound of Silence, and some old folk covers. The album was a total flop. It sold maybe 3,000 copies and was met with a collective shrug. The dream, it seemed, was dead for a second time. A heartbroken Paul Simon packed his bags and moved to England, diving into the London folk scene and even recording a solo album, The Paul Simon Songbook. As far as anyone was concerned, Simon and Garfunkel were done. Simon later said the real breakup of their friendship started after they became huge, but this was the first time they professionally split. But then, something unbelievable happened. Back in the US, a DJ in Boston started playing The Sound of Silence from their failed album. The song started getting requests, first in Boston, then spreading to Florida, then all up and down the East Coast. Tom Wilson, the producer, saw this grassroots buzz happening. Without even telling Paul or Art, he did something radical. He took their original acoustic track and, in a move that would change music history, he overdubbed electric guitars, bass, and drums, the very sound of rock and roll that had first inspired them. This new, electrified The Sound of Silence was released in September 1965. It was a revelation. The folk rock genre was essentially born, and the song shot up the charts. By January 1966, it was number 1. Paul Simon, who was living in London, found out his song was a massive hit by picking up a copy of Billboard magazine. He was floored. Art Garfunkel, still in college, called him with the news, "Paul, we're number 1." Their career, which they both thought was over, had been brought back from the dead by a studio experiment they had nothing to do with. Simon rushed back to the States, and suddenly, the duo was in massive demand. They quickly recorded a new album, perfectly titled Sounds of Silence, to ride the wave of their hit single. The album was a smash, and Simon and Garfunkel went from folk club wannabes to legitimate stars, but this explosion of success also revealed the first real cracks in their foundation. While he was in England, Paul Simon had recorded that solo album. He had a deal with his publisher that let him record it without Art, a move that deeply hurt Garfunkel when he found out. It was the first time Paul had decisively gone his own way, treating his songs as his own property, not theirs. It was a subtle but huge power play. Garfunkel saw it as a betrayal, a secret kept from a friend. For Simon, it was probably just a practical move to keep his career going when the duo seemed dead. This wasn't the only problem. The very way they worked together was creating an imbalance that would only get worse over time. The years after The Sound of Silence were a total whirlwind. Album after album, each one more ambitious and acclaimed than the last. Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Time in 1966 was a studio masterpiece, a lush record that showed just how fast Simon's songwriting was evolving. It had classics like Homeward Bound and Scarborough Fair/Canticle, and that last one was a brilliant arrangement by Garfunkel, weaving a traditional English ballad with one of Simon's anti-war songs. This was them at the peak of their creative partnership. Simon was the architect, building these intricate lyrical and melodic structures. Garfunkel was the master craftsman, adding the soaring harmonies and heavenly textures that gave the songs their signature, transcendent feel. His work on Scarborough Fair is a perfect example of his genius. He wasn't just singing along, he was building a whole vocal counter-story, a second, ghostly melody that turned the song into something otherworldly. Then came the 1967 film The Graduate. The director, Mike Nichols, loved their music and licensed a bunch of their existing songs and asked for new ones. The film became a cultural phenomenon, and its soundtrack, with the huge hit, Mrs. Robinson, was even bigger. The song won them a Grammy for Record of the Year, and for a minute there, Simon and Garfunkel were the biggest band in the world. Their 1968 album Bookends was a conceptual masterpiece, a meditation on life and time that saw them pushing the boundaries of what pop music could be. From the outside, they were on top of the world. But inside the partnership, things were getting tense. The heart of the problem was what Simon himself later called the uneven partnership. Paul Simon wrote the songs. He wrote the words, he wrote the melodies, and as time went on, he took more and more control in the studio. Art Garfunkel, for all his vocal brilliance, was ultimately just interpreting another man's vision. This created a deep frustration for Simon. He would spend months, sometimes a year, carefully crafting a song. He'd bring it to the studio, work on the arrangement, and guide the recording. Then, Art would step up to the mic, deliver a flawless, beautiful vocal, and when they played live, the audience would go absolutely wild for Garfunkel's singing of a song that Simon had poured his own soul into creating. Simon admitted he felt a sting of jealousy, a resentment that the crowd didn't seem to know the difference between the singer and the creator. For Garfunkel, it was just as complicated. He was famous for his voice, but he had almost no say in where the duo was heading creatively. In a way, he was like a salaried employee in a company that had his name on it. He depended entirely on Simon's songwriting. If Paul didn't write, Art didn't sing. This lack of control must have been infuriating for an intelligent, ambitious guy. He wasn't just a singer, he was an architect by training, a man with his own ideas. But in the world of Simon and Garfunkel, he was increasingly just the beautiful voice. The power balance was completely skewed, and it was warping their friendship. The easy camaraderie of their youth was being replaced by professional tension. They were becoming, as one person noted, two men standing on opposite sides of a creative wall. Simon was the restless artist, always pushing forward. Garfunkel was the perfectionist, the guardian of that pure sound that made them famous. These different approaches were putting them on a collision course. The stage was now set for the final, explosive act of their partnership, an album that would be both their greatest achievement and their tombstone. By 1969, Simon and Garfunkel were starting to work on what would be their last studio album. The tensions that had been simmering for years were about to boil over, and the thing that lit the fuse was a huge new opportunity for Art Garfunkel, Hollywood. Mike Nichols, the director who made them megastars with The Graduate, cast Garfunkel in his highly anticipated movie adaptation of the novel Catch 22. For Garfunkel, this was a chance to be his own man, to be more than just the guy who sang Paul Simon songs. It was a chance to be a star in his own right. But for Paul Simon, it felt like a profound betrayal. The filming was only supposed to take a few weeks, but the production dragged on for months. Garfunkel was off on a movie set in Mexico, while Simon was back in New York, alone, expected to write an entire album by himself. Simon was incredibly frustrated. He felt abandoned. He was the one left doing all the creative heavy lifting while his partner was off living a glamorous movie star life. He later pointed to this exact period as the final breaking point. "We were really best friends up until Bridge Over Troubled Water," Simon said in the 2024 documentary In Restless Dreams. Afterwards, it didn't have the harmony of the friendship that was broken. Despite the growing bitterness, Simon kept writing. And what he wrote was extraordinary. He penned The Boxer, a sprawling epic about loneliness and perseverance. And then he wrote the song that would define them, a song born directly from the chaos of their relationship, Bridge Over Troubled Water. It came to him in a flash of inspiration, a gospel-infused melody with lyrics of unconditional support. "When you're weary, feelin' small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all." It was a song of deep comfort, and ironically, Simon wrote it specifically for Garfunkel's voice. He knew only Art's pure, soaring tenor could do it justice. He showed the song to Garfunkel, insisting that he sing it solo. At first, Garfunkel was hesitant. He thought the song was too simple, not really their style. He thought Paul should sing it. But Paul was insistent. This was Art's song. Garfunkel finally gave in and delivered what is arguably the single greatest vocal performance of his entire career. It was an absolute masterpiece of control, emotion, and technical skill, but the song itself became another source of conflict. When they performed it live, the second Garfunkel sang the final note, the entire audience would leap to its feet in a massive standing ovation. For Paul Simon, standing off to the side with his guitar, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He had written the song. He had poured all his feelings of anxiety and his desire for comfort into it. And yet, all the love in the room was being aimed at the singer. He confessed years later to the intense jealousy he felt in those moments, that feeling of being erased from his own masterpiece. The rest of the album was recorded in a storm of arguments. The personal and professional gap was now a chasm. Garfunkel took another acting role, this time in the movie Carnal Knowledge, which meant he'd be gone for a long time again. This infuriated Simon, who had written a song called Cuba See, Nixon No, that he wanted to work on together, but Art refused because he didn't like how political it was. They fought bitterly. Simon finally proposed that after this album, they just take a break from each other. Garfunkel agreed. The end was near. When Bridge Over Troubled Water was finally released in January 1970, it was a global phenomenon. It hit number 1 in over 10 countries, won 6 Grammy Awards, including Album and Song of the Year, and became one of the best-selling albums of all time. It was their greatest triumph, a success on a scale they had never seen before. And it was the last thing they would ever do together. At the absolute height of their fame, with the world at their feet, Simon and Garfunkel broke up. There was no press conference, no farewell tour. They just walked away. The partnership that started in a school play and grew into a global force was over. The perfect harmony had dissolved into a bitter silence. The bridge they had built for millions had collapsed under the weight of their own troubled waters. The 1970 breakup wasn't the end of the story, it was just the start of a new, painful chapter filled with public spats, failed reunions, and decades of resentment. Both men immediately started solo careers, and the difference in their paths only seemed to make the divide deeper. Paul Simon released a string of critically and commercially successful albums, cementing his reputation as one of the great songwriters of his generation, especially with experimental masterpieces like 1980's Excess Graceland. Art Garfunkel also had solo success, with hits like All I Know and Bright Eyes, but his career never quite hit the same heights as Simon's. This difference in their solo success just added more fuel to the fire.